Our final speaker is Joshua Edward. Joshua has worked in public health and social epidemiology for over 2 decades, mostly devoted to issues that disproportionately impact gender and sexual minorities in both direct and indirect ways. Joshua has devoted his work to community-based participatory research and primary prevention, working with communities as diverse as gay, bi, and MSM sex workers to adolescents in rural and remote communities throughout Alaska. Joshua has developed his research skills in a variety of both community and public health settings, including with the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. He now works as Knowledge Translation Manager at HIM here in Vancouver, where he works in partnership with community and partnering agencies to develop health promotion and HIV and STI prevention campaigns based upon the best available current evidence and scientific medical recommendations. He's especially interested in developing campaigns and initiatives that support both evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence, and the integration of alternative forms of knowledge from the community. Joshua was also completing a doctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. Please join me in welcoming Joshua.
Thanks, Patrick. I was sitting down there so I could watch the slides, and it's really hot up here. So I'm going to be talking about my doctoral research, which really focuses on LGBTIQ communities that engage in agriculture, what we might call ecologies of social difference. There might be a lot of kind of queer theory gobbledygook in this that I will try and just pretty much translate into common language. We're going to start with this, which was probably the most popular postcard you would ever see anywhere in Montana when I was growing up. It says Montana Double Date on the bottom, and it's 2 cowboys in the front of the pickup and their dogs in the back. And maybe 2 months ago, I remembered this postcard, and I was like, that postcard was really gay. I don't think that was their intention, but when I revisited it, I was like, it's really funny. And so I think it's really particularly symbolic of my work because it kind of recognizes that there's been gay by MSM farmers probably as long as there's been farmers. They aren't always visible. It also recognizes sometimes that rural communities react differently to queer sexuality. And sometimes they treat it in coded language, sometimes they treat it humorously, sometimes they treat it very dangerously. But then I think on a little more serious note related to stigma, it illustrates that as growing up on a farm as I did, a lot of us who grew up farmers really were kind of viewed as bumpkins. And so part of the charm and the humor in this card was this idea of these bumpkin ranchers, So really my study just supposes that there's intersections between agricultural production practices and gender and sexuality. And that by looking at the range of those production practices and those intersections of sexual identity and agriculture, we might then be able to create potentially new understandings of both queer sexuality and agriculture. That those understandings may then lead to the identification of new perspectives and practices in farming and ecological sustainability. And really, my study is very interdisciplinary, involving queer theory, feminist political ecology, actual agroecology, etc. So how did I get here from a background in public health and doing all of this public health research and then studying gay farmers? 4th generation rancher, raised on a farm in Montana. Started doing a lot of urban agriculture in Salt Lake City as part of my master's degree, and then in Vancouver. And in Vancouver particularly, I started to recognize that there were a ton of queer farmers. And I started really recognizing that there were discrepancies between cultural narratives around queer sexuality in agriculture versus what I personally experienced. So again, the idea that farms or rural spaces are inherently homophobic. And me really looking critically back on my existence and my life growing up and not really feeling like it might have been that much different than somebody who grew up queer in a city. And then the recognition finally that institutionalized homophobia and heteronormativity in agriculture and food systems research including just the wholesale, almost exclusion of queer individuals and perspectives in most mainstream ecological and agricultural sustainability narratives. Hence, the first ever study of queer farmers. I really want to move away from anecdotes and presumptions and provide opportunities for queer farmers themselves to speak about their experiences working in agriculture and living in rural communities, because I think we rely on a lot of stereotypes and hearsay from urban gay men around what life in the country is supposed to be like. I also think that we need to really recognize and own that there are unique relationships that we as queer people have with agriculture and ecology. And that we have unique perspectives that might help us improve agricultural practice and sustainability. And then finally, to really make agricultural science more inclusive and illustrate the ways that heteronormativity and homophobia have negatively impacted agricultural science. To get here, I actually had to replace my entire doctoral committee, because my first doctoral committee was had zero interest and zero support in this topic. So I had to completely start from scratch and rebuild with some folks who were, thankfully, interested. But why would it matter, or how could it possibly be that queer farmers farm differently than other people? Well, basically, one of the kind of founding canonical concepts of queer theory is that you really can't separate the individual from the greater context in which that individual lives. Sexuality, gender, nature, even temporality, so even time, really can't be said to exist outside of the realm of socio-political construction. One of the best authors on the topic. Ideas and practices of nature, including both bodies and landscapes, are located in particular productions of sexuality and sex, both historically and in the present, located in particular formations of nature. So a really good, simple example of this is the history of queer people being described as unnatural. And then what does that say in our relationship with the quote-unquote natural world? So what does queer ecology and agriculture represent? First and foremost, it really represents an alternative to and a refutation of really the heteronormative assumptions of sustainability. I help teach courses up at UBC. When we ask undergraduate students what sustainability is, they typically say something about, ensuring that there's going to be food 7 generations down the road. So these ideas that really are very, very heteronormatively rooted around the idea that sustainability is only important from a reproductive perspective. But then on a really, really practical level, and the more I did my research, the more it kind of became obvious to me that our community just might have new perspectives and new ideas that could really challenge kind of the industrialized systems of food production, and that this exclusion of queer communities and perspectives from ecological and agricultural disciplines could really be negatively impacting the development of some new, better practices. Most importantly, though, I think it's just and ethical to expand ecological and agricultural research to include diverse communities. Again, I think it's very practical and in everybody's best interest to expand this study to every diverse community out there, because we really don't know who is going to have the ideas or the solutions to meet what is, for those of us who work in farming or food, the food system's in crisis and we need all hands on deck. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. Again, so we need farmers, we need all hands on deck, and we need to really recognize that the same systems that really systematically discriminated against queer individuals and communities were the same political systems that created the modern industrialized food system, and we can't look to dominant patriarchal systems to fix the mess that they created. And this is where I think that queer farmers have possibly some really unique perspectives and solutions. So the study itself was an ethnography of self-identified queer farmers throughout British Columbia. When I say self-identified, to get institutional approval without going through heightened review, basically I had to figure out a way in which I could not have people risk being outed. So I couldn't have people say contact this person, I think they're gay. If the person had self-identified as gay to that person, then I could contact them and send them an invitation letter that would ask them if they would like to participate. But I used referral-based sampling, started with the Rainbow Chard Collective, which is a queer farmer collective here in British Columbia. And then I did interview-based fieldwork using questions that pretty much fell within 10 thematic domains, ranging kind of from personal history and agriculture to the promotion of ecological biodiversity in British Columbia, land tenure and security in rural and urban environments, etc. And I completed interviews with 25 participants, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it took a lot of time, and that was what my committee told me to do, so I did it. So just an example of some of the questions that I asked. So the impact of gender and sexuality on livelihood, location of residence, and land tenure security. So do you recognize a unique role and or influence of your self-identified gender or sexuality on your location of residence, i.e. rural versus urban? And the reason I used language like gender and sexuality was to include transgender individuals as part of my sample if they wanted to participate. So it was pretty amazing because the findings were that overwhelmingly, I think every single person I interviewed except one identified really specific links between queer identity and the ways that they farmed. They also really, really overwhelmingly recognized the role of cultural heteronormativity in shaping the way that other people farmed or mainstream farming, and they recognize a unique role for queer farmers in presenting alternative models and new ways of farming. And I think probably one of the most dominant themes to come out of it was a lot of queer people talked about anything from my whole life I've lived in margins, or my whole life I feel like I've lived in two different worlds, or I've always lived in these kind of liminal spaces. And that idea of living in multiple kind of worlds really made them feel like they could think differently about farming practices, that they could have a unique perspective other than those that are in the kind of dominant farming or agricultural discourse. Unexpectedly, though, and I think some of the most interesting things was that not a single rural participant experienced any sort of outward homophobia, hostility, or lack of support from their greater communities. A lot of the rural participants, they really did speak to the fact that there are different social norms in rural communities, but they also were really clear that rural communities and urban communities are different in many, many, many ways, including the ways in which queer people live. But those ways aren't necessarily homophobic. And I would say that most of the rural participants really discussed a lot of themes around feeling at odds with urban gay identity. Or feeling like they had, if they had grown up farmers, that they had been stigmatized as farmers by urban gay kind of metronormative queer values. I shared last night, I know when I went to my first kind of like big city gay party as a 20-year-old, somebody asked me if I graduated high school when I, said that I had grown up on a farm, because the assumption was that, if you grew up on a farm, you didn't graduate high school. I'll show him my PhD when I'm finished. It's probably part of the reason why I ended up doing this damn PhD. So Halberstam, who's an amazing, Judith Jack Halberstam, an amazing trans queer theorist, wrote a great quote. Certain sexual liberation discourse recapitulates the terms of the homo-hetero binary that oppress minority sexual subjects in the first place, and in doing so, become part of the very sexual hierarchy they seek to oppose. Simply put, when urban queer individuals castigate or make people who live in rural areas feel like they're not part of the queer community, or if they make them feel like they're kind of like simple or backwards or unintelligent or misunderstood, this is reinforcing the same types of destructive homophobic attitudes that, the heteronormative culture gives us. And I think a big piece of what I took away from my research is a real realignment with what I understood it to mean to be gay. And especially that there's no right way to be gay. And I think that was something that a lot of my study participants talked about too, is just that, they tried cities and that it didn't feel like it fit them as individuals. So some quotes that were pretty amazing that came out of it. I've waited my whole life for someone to recognize how important this is and ask me these questions. Something that we've talked about a lot and have in common growing up and feeling like it was an opportunity and a gift to be queer and grow up asking questions about ourselves and our place in the world, like constant self-analysis or even everything analysis. Like just looking for my own way in this life. As far as farming, when I saw what I was supposed to do, I looked around me and it wasn't what my heart was telling me what to do. My queerness helped me put the brakes on and totally stop this, what you're supposed to do thinking. My queerness is the opportunity to wipe the slate clean and say, here we are, this is the land, what will we create? And that creates more questions than answers. In cities, most people have no questions. Everyone knows queer people. And in rural areas, that's not necessarily the case. So it's so important that we contribute to that exposure and to show the world how different it is to be queer and that the ways that we live on the land and grow our food. And this is by far my favorite quote from my entire dissertation. We went out to that first farm we bought in Manitoba, and it was a nightmare. We almost just left. There was garbage everywhere, and it was falling apart. And then this old man in a bonnet and lipstick came around the corner, and we stopped and said, oh my God, we have to talk to her. And this guy had all these animals living with him, but only males. All roosters, all bulls, and he would always wear a bonnet and full makeup. And he had affairs with all the men who lived in the area. He identified by name as a woman, Phyllis Berries. I will tell you this, the locals took care of him. Phyllis was one of their own. They would check on him, they would feed him, and make sure he was okay. So we bought his farm, and it took a great deal of work. And that overhaul, that really got us known in the community. We had to ask for advice and help a lot. I mean, I know my dad was the same way. We got to know all of our neighbors right away. The neighbors were always helping each other, dredging our land when we got flooded, and it was this old Ukrainian and Mennonite community, and they just accepted us. I'm sure some of the older ones just assumed we were bachelors, but we definitely weren't closeted. And so they had bought that farm in northern Manitoba in the 80s. And this is, until you actually spend time like talking to people, talking to queer individuals who live in rural areas, you don't get a picture of what it's like. And the very, very compelling reasons that those individuals live there. And then probably my second favorite. I think queer people are history's change makers. We look around corners. For some people, straight people included, we have this kind of mysticism. People look to our community for what's important. For centuries, they looked to us for culture and art, and for me, that our community now is looking at farming and food and sustainability, that's maybe what's most profound. Gay rights has made so much progress, but then you look at younger gay men and you wonder what's their gay center. I mean, so much of this is one queer identity, this urban gay identity. And a lot of that is really just heteronormative now. So, as farmers in a rural community, we're actually the queer option, in a sense. And I think this was something else that really started to emerge, was the idea that it wasn't even just about moving to rural spaces to farm because they hadn't felt comfortable in cities. It was the idea that queer life in cities has really become, for many, many people, not all that different than lives for heteronormative straight couples. And that the queer thing to do at this point is to get out of cities. The queer thing is to move to rural spaces. The queer thing is to grow food. So there's some quotes. End of my technical presentation. I think I would say definitely moving ahead. Somebody needs to do some more research around rural queer lives. I think we as a queer community really do still have kind of like a deficit-based understanding of what it means to be gay and not live in a city. I think there were some interesting issues around what farming and succession looked like for queer farmers. People who don't have kids, what do you do with the farm as you age, just as Patrick was talking about. So definitely some more work to be done. Have just finished coding my data and will be writing and hopefully finishing in May. So that's queer farming in a nutshell.